you. Thank you. I wasn't expecting a gift. I thought that you guys sponsoring my sister to be here was the gift. So, as I've just given away the secret, my sister is tonight's speaker. And I have just finished, thank you, Larry, I have just finished my second 10-year term on the board of the World Affairs Council. And if one can't get one's sister into town after 20 years on the board, I'm not really sure who could. So I really, really appreciate the World Affairs Council asking Katherine to be here. I didn't have to say more than about 2 sentences of her work and her life before everybody sitting at the table at that board meeting said, oh my God, when can she get down here? So I didn't have to twist any arms, I just had to tell a little bit about Katherine. And the parts that I didn't tell were that she has worked so hard for so long. It is just amazing what she has accomplished. If you think about what it was like to be a young woman in 1973 deciding, well, I think I'll do my field work behind the Iron Curtain. For the young people in the audience, there was this thing called the Iron Curtain. And Katherine was interested in Soviet bloc countries, communist countries. Anthropologists studied people in primitive societies. Katherine wanted to know how people lived and what the culture was like for people in the communist bloc. And in the 1970s, we didn't know that. How brave was that to decide that I'll just go to this part of the world that nobody went to? She ended up in Romania because that was the only country basically in the communist bloc that was allowing foreign researchers to come in. The part that she wouldn't know a lot about was how scary it was for our parents. We didn't get many letters from her. Anytime we got a letter, she would always refer to, thank you for your letter of such and such date, because half of our letters didn't get through. Of course, there was no internet. Telephone service was really spotty. So half the time, we frankly didn't know if she was dead or alive, and that was a little bit frightening for the parents. But they were so proud of her. And she has just done so much to help us all understand a very different culture. So, when her secret police file was released to her in 2008, she had, unfortunately, she learned some things from reading her own file. And it is amazing, it's an amazing story that I will leave her to tell, but she has worked really hard for a really long time and has really advanced a lot of people's understanding by having taught at several different universities, University of Michigan, Johns Hopkins University, and of course City University of New York now. She has taught so many students, and the ripple effects I know will be around for years and years and years. So without further ado, let me present my sister, Dr. Katherine Verdery. So lucky as to have a wonderful sister like that. I feel blessed. And also by your presence here. I'm going to start by just reading the first paragraph of the preface. There's nothing like reading your secret police file to make you wonder who you really are. Page after page, all your activities, all your motives are subjected to a reading from an alien position embodied in a logic different from anything you recognize. Events you remember as significant might appear without comment, while others you thought unimportant burgeon into grounds for your expulsion from the country. Now, I could keep going on about this, but I think I'll talk a little bit more about my how I got this file and so on. So, as Margaret said, in 1973, I headed off to Romania to do field work for my doctoral dissertation in anthropology. And field work for anthropologists usually means that you go and hang out with people and you talk to them. In my case, I hung out with people who lived in a small village in Transylvania. And so it means that you really have to have conditions that are optimal for conversing with other people in a trusting way. I did not have that. I was interested in communism in a sort of
not a professional way, but because I've been living with it all the time. I grew up and I was always interested. When it was time to write a speech for high school, I wrote a speech about Russia, and I wrote another term paper about Cuba, and it just seemed to me, I also tried to teach myself Russian when I was 8 years old. I didn't get past conjugations because I didn't know what that was. So when I started off on this trip, I was 25 years old, and I had planned this research with a specific project that I fully intended to do, and I picked a project that I thought would not cause a lot of problems. Turned out I was wrong about that, but I was going under no pretext. I was doing the thing that I said I was going to do, and then I was going to go write a dissertation. I spent a year in this village, a year and a half altogether in Romania in the early 1970s. And then I went back several times, 79, 80, 84, 85, 87, and 88, for a total of just over 3 years of work in that space of time. And then in 1989, the Romanian communist regime collapsed. And for another 10 years, there was a lot of chaos in the country, but a lot of conversation around the question of the secret police files. Now, this had begun to be an issue already at the very beginning. In Czechoslovakia in 1990, they passed laws called lustration laws. And lustration is a word that means vetting or checking out, verifying. And the idea with these laws was not to have the old communists back in power, the old secret police people, but to have ways of there being, anybody who wants to run for public office has to be checked through the archive of the secret police files to see if they had worked as secret police officers or as collaborators in some way. So that was the plan with this lustration law. That better? Okay, so let me see. The other countries of Eastern Europe that were going to pass such laws had already done so before Romania finally did it in 1999. In 2000, I began working in the archive of the secret police because I was involved in a research project for which I was told these archives might have some interesting information. And I went back every summer for a month or a week or two, and I got to know the people in the reading room who helped us with our material. And in 2006, this one staff woman, her name is Florica Dobre, said to me, "Why don't you apply for your secret police file?" And I said, "I didn't know I could, and I don't know that I'd want to see it." And she said, "Well, why don't you apply for it? And it might not come ever. It might take a long time for them to find it, but eventually if it comes, you can decide then if you want to read it." So I didn't have anything else to do. I wasn't involved in another project. And in 2008, I was told that I had my files, which amounted to 2,781 pages. Now, I've already violated the rules of composition for secret police files because I have given you a chronology. I started in 73 and I went through the 80s. The secret police file is not organized chronologically. It consists of reports by the case officers and other people, reports by informers, reports of the people who have checked my correspondence, reports of the people who have followed me, reports of the people who have installed technology in my quarters. So the cover of my book is a surveillance photo of myself from 1984, taken with a video camera installed looking at my bed. so they could see what was going on there. So each of these kinds of documents is grouped in a set. And when I first read the files, I found myself completely confused by what to make of it, because I couldn't find myself in this set of reports. But mostly I was completely appalled, and I freaked out big time. I came back, I had them Xerox the file, and I bought a new suitcase to take it home. It was too big for me to bring in what I already had with me. And then I was talking with my partner at home, Phyllis Mack, sitting right here, and I said, what am I going to do with this? And she said, well, you should write a memoir. And again, I thought, well, I don't have another project right now, so maybe I'll think about doing that. And I thought, this could be interesting. So what were my motivations for actually taking the time to look at this thing and to read it over and over and over again? I think I've read it about 7 or 8 times by now. And the first 3 times, I continued to be furious and very upset by it. And then I started to get used to it and begin to ask myself the questions that an anthropologist always asks. Why would this person who's reporting on me have felt he or she had to do that? What was their situation, their personal situation, that made them agree to be recruited for reporting? Things of that kind. I was also interested in trying to come to terms with my experience and with the person that I found in the files, whom I didn't like all that much for the first few readings. I also thought it would be interesting to learn something more about the secret police, an organization about which I knew practically nothing because I had always assumed that it was unavailable for research. But reading through all of these reports was a great way for me to begin to understand how this organization worked. How did they think about what a spy was, what spying meant? What was it that they thought I was doing? And so this was a remarkable opportunity to use these files as data for understanding the organization. So I, as I say, read it multiple times. I also connected it with my field notes from the period, which I had kept. So I could read back and occasionally find, and that way I was able to identify some of my informers, because the informer report might not give the person's name, but it would be on a date and when the person had met with me for dinner. And then I look in my little diary and see that on that date I was having dinner with so-and-so. I reorganized the whole thing chronologically in order to connect it with the documents I had in my possession. And now I'm just going to read you a couple of things from one of the surveillance reports. From surveillance of the named Katherine Verdery and from her notes obtained in photocopy on the occasion of secret searches, it results indubitably that she is collecting information of a socio-political character, which she interprets in a falsified and hostile manner, and although it is not secret, can be used against the interests of our country. Given this operative situation, we consider it necessary to act urgently toward achieving the following objectives. 1, impeding the actions she undertakes to form trustworthy persons among Romanian citizens, which might lead to her recruiting some of these persons into organized plots against our country. So my work depends on making contacts with people. Their job here is to keep me from making contacts. Preventing the publication of the work she writes, which would disinform public opinion concerning the Romanian people and realities in Romania. And then they have some actions they're going to take. And at the end, they say, through a plausible scheme, we will make her field notes disappear so she cannot use them in writing the work she is preparing. So this is kind of what I was up against. If you think that I didn't revisit my fieldwork as a result of reading this, saying, my God, this was what was going on all around me, and I had no idea. So it took me 10 years from the time I got the file to the time I finished, had the book published. And I won't go into too much detail about why that was, but basically I had no idea how to do what I was setting out to do. I'd never written a memoir. I wasn't sure that I was worth a memoir. Memoirs are for famous people. I was just a lowly little anthropologist. But there were also a lot of difficult questions to consider, such as the ethics of treating the people who had been informing on me. How should I think about them? Some of them were pretty good friends. Should I feel that they had betrayed me? Was that an adequate response? And as I thought about this, I began seeing ways in which I had betrayed my Romanian friends without meaning to. So I began becoming a little less exigent with my informers, thinking, you know, they had families to protect, and if the officer came and told them that they would, their son would not get into university if they didn't report on me, then I'd have to see that. I can't say that's a form of betrayal. That's their way of coping with a bad situation that their family is implicated in. Big question about what to do with people's names. So in the files, all informers are given pseudonyms. And even now, there are several people that I can't identify. I don't know who they were. But a lot of them I did know. I figured it out myself, or the archive identified them for me. And so what was I going to do with their names? Was I going to use their names? Or was I going to give them pseudonyms? And I decided to give them pseudonyms. I made up pseudonyms for them, different from the ones that the secret police had given them. And this means that, to some extent, this whole book is also a kind of fiction. Because in order to protect people's identities, I had to make up some facts about their lives. And I did this because I wanted to protect especially the friends that were willing to have lengthy conversations with me about what it meant for them to be informing. So that was one set of questions. Another set of questions was what to do about dealing with Securitate officers. What would be the ethics of that? I decided at one point to try to meet a few of the officers who had handled my case. And I went onto the internet and I put in whitepages.ro and up came the Romanian telephone book. And I found the names of two of my secret police officers, and one of them had an address but no phone number, and the other had a phone number but no address. And so I used this information to get in touch with these people. Wrote them a letter, which I had mailed through the Romanian post, saying, here's who I am, and I'm writing this book, and I'd like to have your views about it so I can present the most objective picture possible. And so here's where I'll be on such and such and such and such a day, and here is my local phone number, and please let me know if you would like to accept my invitation. And two of them accepted the invitation, and so we set a place to meet, and I met with them. The third guy was the one who didn't have a telephone number in the white pages. And for him, I just found out I was able to go to his address, and I bought a bouquet of flowers ahead of time, took them up with me, and rang the buzzer. And he answered, and I said, I have some flowers for you. And he didn't ask who I was, I just went up, and there he was. So he had no opportunity to get rid of me in a graceful way, and eventually he invited me into his apartment, and finally he got comfortable enough that he actually sat down, and we had a conversation of almost 2 hours in which he told me some very interesting things. And then the third person that I saw, also I did through this writing the letter through the mail, and he turned out to be the most interesting of all. He was a very extremely friendly guy, although throughout the conversation his shoulder was going like this, and I thought that was rather endearing. And all three of these meetings produced an extraordinary effect in me, because all three of them seemed like really nice fellows who had been fairly forthcoming in the questions that I'd asked, answering the questions that I'd asked them. And they were definitely trying to present their organization as a good organization that was doing important things. They said, you know, after all, it was the Cold War. We had to make sure that bad people weren't coming into our country. That's why we followed you. And so I had the feeling that I'd made these new friends, and then I would sort of come back to reality and say, don't be ridiculous, you haven't made 3 friends. But it did create a problem for me in terms of my feeling of distaste for the whole organization, the feeling that I had absorbed from my Romanian friends and carried around with me. And so I wasn't really sure what to do. So I reported these conversations with them, or parts of them, in the book. And then at the end of that, on the advice of a Romanian friend of mine who said, if you don't take a position on this, the Romanians are going to hate you. So at the end I said, well, these guys were nice to me, but their organization was lousy. That was the ethical position that I arrived at. So then I got interested in the problem of explaining some of the things that I found in there. So, for example, why did they repeatedly let me into the country? I must have gone back 6 or 7 times, always with the same kind of research grant, and never with any hesitation. That send in the research grant, it would come back accepted. It was an exchange program. And so they let me in over and over again, but then in the files I see that they're over and over again just on the verge of throwing me out, or of declaring me persona non grata, or of not letting me ever come back. So what sense does this make? How do we make sense of this kind of discrepancy? How does surveillance work in this kind of system? And then, as I said earlier, I had to try to come to terms with the person, myself, that I found there, who seemed to me brash, not a little bit impatient, and somewhat arrogant. And I thought, how can a person like that have done good research in anthropology? So I worked hard to become accepting of the person that I had been then, and it was actually rather difficult. So another reason why it took me a long time to get this book done. So why might this audience be interested in this book? First of all, I think that any form of contact with other societies and cultures is a form of world affairs. It's a form of foreign relations. My book has actually been reviewed in the journal Foreign Affairs. So thinking about this problem of how we come to know other places is not one that should be strange to those of you interested in world affairs. Secondly, you might be interested in the question of surveillance. It's an increasingly common experience for us all now. What's it like? And as I said at the beginning, there's nothing like reading your secret police file to make you wonder who you really are. The kind of surveillance that I was under was what I call labor-intensive surveillance. So it involved a lot of physical bodies following me, listening to the tapes of conversations that I'd had, writing up reports. And in contrast to that, we have our very technology-intensive forms of surveillance now, which are becoming ever more prevalent. And the recent scandal involving Facebook has been tremendously revealing in that way. So it seemed to me that this could be a subject that you would all have some interest in for that reason. And then the third reason is that I was trying to get a sense of the logic of secret police work. And the file did give me a sense of that as I read it over and over again. How did these people work? So that on November 9th, 2016, the morning after the US presidential election, I walked into my class and I said, Vladimir Putin has hacked the American election. And they were stunned. I was the first person I know of to have said that at the time. And why was that? Because I had learned from reading my file that the way these guys operated was with the goal of sowing chaos, creating confusion and disorder, trying to keep people off balance. I have a colleague who wrote a really fabulous paper. I can't give you his name because after he'd written the paper, but before he had published it, he was warned by somebody he assumes is a secret police man. This was in 2009, not to continue with this line of work. So the paper circulates in samizdat with a number of appreciative readers who will not use his name to keep from getting into trouble. So he's writing about how secret police in his home country, which is not Romania but very similar to it, became the new businessmen after 1989. But they were not following the rules of capitalism. They were not doing free and fair competition. Rather, they were mafias of oligarchs who are largely connected with the secret police from before. They likely control the economies of many of the post-socialist countries, certainly Romania, Bulgaria, Russia, Ukraine, and more. And because they have these secret police connections, it's like belonging to a secret society. That's guarantee for them. And their ability then to outmaneuver other people who are trying to become new entrepreneurs in the post-communist countries is quite remarkable. It looks to me then as if the collapse of communism did not usher in democracy and free markets as we expected and still sometimes seem to hope, but rather mafias of oligarchs with secret police connections, relatively high solidarity that could push people from our country out of business, rather than being transformed into obedient little capitalist democrats. So that's the result of my encounter with my file, and I hope that you might have some questions that I can answer that will help to clarify this.
Yes, texting or where's the microphone?
Here is a person over here. Or did you have that?
How certain are you that you saw your entire file?
I can't be 100% certain, but there is material in there from all of the places that I spend any time and all of my research trips. So it's close enough. And it's quite possible that there is other stuff, but there's quite a lot in this as it is. This is really fine with me. I don't need any more.
Did you at any point while you were in Romania feel that maybe something was off, maybe you were being watched, maybe, I mean, did you have any level of discomfort during the time that you were there that maybe somebody was keeping tabs on you in a way that you might not like?
In the 1970s, I was unbelievably naive about this. We got an orientation from the American Embassy when we arrived in Bucharest. And they said, oh, you have to be really careful. People are going to be following you. They're going to be listening to your phone calls. They're going to be reading your correspondence, blah, blah, blah. And I and most of the other people on research grants, a lot of us graduate students, sort of thought, oh yeah, here they are, the old Cold War mentality coming out. And we sort of blew it off. We didn't forget it, but we sort of blew it off. And I would sometimes, listen to this, ask one or another of my friends out in the village where I was working, have the secret police or police been bothering you in any way? Oh no, they said. And after 2018, or after 2008, when I got my file and started talking with them about how much surveillance I was under, I would say, you know, back in 1978, you answered my questions saying, no, no. And they said, oh, of course people were coming and asking us about you, we just didn't want to say. So, but it wasn't anywhere near as prevalent in the 1970s as it was in the 1980s. And then I had people from one or the other of the villages that I was living in say to me, you know, you should be careful talking to Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so because they really are, they collaborate with the secret police and they're following you. Other sorts of warning signs. They would tell, one person told me a story one time that she'd gone to a meeting at which the secret police, the regular policemen, they often used regular police as auxiliaries, had been telling everybody not to talk to the American because she was a spy and she tape recorded everything. And so they tell me this, and my reaction, well, what am I supposed to do about this? Can I have no conversations at all? No trust possible in any of these relationships? So what they succeeded in doing was making me even more terrified of the possibilities of having decent human interchange with the people that I was there to work with. So I got this kind of information on a number of occasions, but it was nowhere near enough to match what I encountered in this file when I got it. Yes.
What about the U.S. government? Were they ever interested in your time there and coming back and forth over, several years and the amount of time that you were there?
Yes, but in an odd sort of way. I was sitting in my office at Johns Hopkins one day and the phone rang and it was a woman claiming that she was from the FBI and she wanted to talk to me, and I said, fine, go ahead, I don't have anybody in my office now. And she said, no, I want to come and see you in person. So we made an appointment, and she showed up, and she was a very modest, unassuming sort of person who seemed to know almost nothing about the country that I had been working in. She said, did people ever try to be friendly with you? Well, Romanians are among the friendliest people I've ever encountered, so they were always trying to be friendly with me. Did they ever try to get you to buy things for them? Absolutely. Everybody wanted a pair of blue jeans or some coffee from the dollar store and so on. So it seemed to me, as I say, that she really didn't know very much about where I had been. And I asked her, so why is this happening? What have I done lately that brings you to my office? What I thought was that it was because I had taken my first trip to the Soviet Union the previous year and that they were wanting to talk to me about that. And she said, well, I'm not at liberty to answer your question. And so eventually she left. And one thing that struck me about it that also helped me to think about my informers later on was that I was nervous as a cat throughout this interview, even though I knew I had absolutely nothing to hide. I was really nervous. And I thought, if she'd asked me to do something, would I have been more likely to listen to her inducements, given that I felt already scared and frightened? I wasn't encountering anything like the Romanian secret police. So I have a colleague in anthropology who's published a number of books using the FOIA requests on a lot of famous anthropologists. And I asked him to look at the 16 pages that I got when I requested my file through FOIA. It was almost entirely redacted. There was hardly anything you could read. And he said, looking at it, that he thought on the numbers that were on it and the positions of the various bits of writing and so on, thought it wasn't really I that they were interested in, but rather somebody that I knew, and they were following that, a Romanian that I knew and that they were suspicious of. So that was my one and only encounter with the American intelligence services, and I have to say it wasn't very impressive. So,
Well, I have about 20 questions, but I'm only going to ask one or two. One of them, do you speak Romanian?
oh yes. Yeah.
And that's the way you were able eventually to make friends with people and to carry on your research. So looking at it kind of from a different point of view, obviously all those years of research, you've been publishing materials about Romania.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the Romanians were aware of what you were writing and what you were saying here in the United States?
Yes, I do. And the reason is that when I was in Washington for a semester with a fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson Center, there was a guy who kept coming to see me, a Romanian emigre who introduced himself to me shortly after I got there. And he wanted to get together for lunch, and he was writing a book, and he wanted to talk to me and all this kind of stuff. And I didn't think anything about it at the time, but in my file, there are several reports that people sent from Baltimore, where I was living, to the office in Bucharest, saying that I had given a speech at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and that the position I was taking was acceptable. So they were following me enough to have that kind of information.
Part of the reason I let you keep coming back.
Right. Although this was late, it was 1988 that this set of reports came out.
Just a couple of more, if you don't mind. The British historian Timothy Garden Ash wrote a book about his Stasi file in Germany. I wondered if you were familiar with that, and if you weren't in any way helpful to you in figuring out how to write your own book.
How catty can I be? Yes, I was quite familiar with it, and I said, I can do better than this. But it was a useful book for me in that he sort of showed that it was possible to get your secret police file and go visit some of the people that found in it.
So it was helpful.
It was helpful.
And then my last question. One of my favorite films, because I lived in Germany for 8 years, and a couple of years in Berlin, is The Lives of Others. I'm wondering if you're familiar with the film and if you've had a reaction to it.
How many people here saw The Lives of Others? Yeah, it was quite a remarkable film about a secret police officer who was assigned to keep tabs on a famous East German writer and his wife. And it presents this officer as becoming more and more interested in the writer. He's listening to all of these conversations in their apartment, and he's developing sympathy for the guy, and even helps him out with hiding something at some point. Most of the people I've talked with in Romania or even Eastern Germany did not like the movie because they said no secret police operative would ever become sympathetic to his target. And what a couple of my German friends said was that this came out around the time that German unification was really being consolidated, and that part of the point, this friend thought, was to help to make the Stasi officer a sympathetic character so that West Germans could think well of the Stasi. And I thought, well, that's an interesting interpretation, so for what it's worth. As for Romanian, I learned it a little bit before I left, but mostly I learned it by being there. And I'd had French and Latin in high school, so it was not difficult.
Quick question. Looking at your file, you have the facts of your file and then the analysis that the Romanians provided. In your view, were the facts accurate, but the analysis was flawed? Were the facts wrong? In other words, looking at everything, did you find that maybe culturally they were just interpreting things wrong? Or I think you see where I'm going with the question.
If I might substitute the word differently for wrong, there were a number of things that really caught my eye. And one of them was documents in which they would say, she obviously has experience in intelligence because, look, she uses pseudonyms for the people she talks to. She always writes out the question she asked as context for the answer they gave. She writes her field notes in a very coded language. This was true. I left out most of the vowels in words, and I could figure it out later, but they had even more trouble. And so from their point of view, they were looking at somebody they thought was a professional. And this kind of comment shows up in a number of different documents. So what that made me think about was, to what extent is anthropology, anthropological research, a kind of spying? They were convinced that I was a spy, that I was collecting socio-political information that was going to make their country look bad. And if I thought about it from their point of view, I could see their point. So it's a matter of trying to put myself in their place. Now, that's not easy because I really don't know very much about how to put myself in the place of a secret police person. But I didn't, although they had a number of basic facts wrong, they also got a lot of stuff that I was doing and people that I knew and so on. So clearly they were on the right track.
Catherine, how did they know what were in your field notes? And also, did you never feel threatened because you kept going back? I mean, you must have, in your studies, realized how controlled the situation was. Did you never feel threatened? And then the third thing is, why did they ever release the documents? We can't get documents released today. Why did they ever release the documents?
Okay, I'm not going to remember all three. The first one was, anybody under like?
No, how did they know?
No, about my field notes. Yes. Well, they got into my bedroom where I kept my suitcase, and I always kept my notes locked in this American Tourister suitcase that had actually quite powerful locks. And in the early years, they're complaining that they haven't been able to get into my suitcase where my field notes are because the lock, they can't figure out how to get through the lock. Well, they figured it out later. And they would photocopy things. They arranged with a good friend of mine that he was going to come and pick me up one day and take me for a little tour of the county and drive me around to local sites. And so they went in and did that on that one particular occasion, and I assume more often than just that. And they sometimes translated these notes. Some of the notes appear in my file with comment in the margins, yes. So I've just made a description of the black market, and the officer who's reading it says, yes. So that was how they got my field notes. They just got into where I kept them. And I tried to prevent that. I don't think they actually got every field note. But about once a month I would go to Bucharest. I'd keep them in the locked suitcase, and then once a month I'd go to Bucharest. I was making these notes in triplicate, and I sent all the copies through the diplomatic pouch. which grantees had the right to use. And I'd send them seriatim. So the first day I got there, I would send a chunk of them, and then a few days later, another chunk of them, and so on. And one of the things the officers were concerned about was she does not keep any copy of her notes as would be expected of someone writing a dissertation. So they saw even that as problematic. And now the third question.
The second one was about
Well,
feeling
did you
threatened.
not feel threatened?
Oh, threatened, yes. Since I really had no adequate appreciation of how much of this was going on, I mean, I knew that it was happening, but I didn't know really what it amounted to. I didn't really feel threatened, and in fact, I was walking home from a hotel in Bucharest one time at 1 o'clock in the morning, and I said to myself, I would never do this at home. But there are policemen on every corner, and nothing was going to happen to me. So I felt, if anything, safer in that country at the time. Something else I wanted to say to that. Oh yeah, a very dear friend of mine who, with his wife, were under quite close surveillance for a long time, and their telephone was bugged, and there were microphones throughout their house, and some of their friends were called in to be informers. And I was getting together with this guy who had emigrated to West Germany after 1989, and I said, would you have any interest in seeing any of the material about you in my file? And he said, absolutely. So I handed him one of these reports in which the secret police are following him for a trip that had as its objective meeting up with me, and then we were going to go off and have a little weekend together. And he starts reading this description of what they're doing. And he stopped and he put his hand on his heart and he said, I can't go on. He said, I had no idea that it was this bad. So if he, who lived there for his entire life up until the age of about 50, had no idea it was that bad, then unlikely that I would have.
So why did they release the documents?
Oh, why did they release the documents? Well, I mentioned at the beginning that there was a lot of attention to trying to, by the new sort of opposition parties, the ones who had been instrumental in the overthrow of all of the Eastern European regimes, in trying to keep the Communist Party officials and secret police of before from just taking over as the new leaders. And so they wanted there to be a process for vetting anybody who was going to run for major public office, for example, or to apply for a job as the head of a big bank. So that was the reason why they created this archive. But why they let anybody under the sun who had a file go in and look at it, I'm really not sure. I suspect that it might have had to do with trying to wake up the population to what had actually been going on. Just like my friend who said, I can't read anymore, it's too upsetting. I had no idea. So I think they were hoping that more people would have some sense of what had been carried on under the previous regime and might therefore help to keep it from coming back.
Thank you.
So I just have one quick thing and then I'll give the microphone to Phyllis. The Romanians apparently approved enough of Katherine's work that she has now received doctorates from both the University at Bucharest and the University at Cluj. So they apparently approved of something she was doing because she's now got some doctorates.
This is different folks, not the ones before.
Yeah, different folks.
The younger generation.
Is a similar, are similar things known about the Stasi by scholars who are working in Germany? Did you have a chance to think, maybe in comparative terms, how those two movements would relate to each other? Or?
Mm-hmm. There's an enormous book by a guy named Andreas Glaser, a German who did research in the Stasi archives. It's like this. And I used that to make a couple of comparisons with things like the presumed number of informers and the presumed number of secret police officers and things like that. But you can't have a lot of belief in these figures, it's just orientated. But the East German Stasi files were the ones that people had the best luck with, in a sense, because right after the beginning of the uprising in Germany, people would go to the local Stasi office and pull the guys out of there and put out the fires that they were already lighting and collect the documents that had already been shredded. And if you believe it, some enormous number of files were reconstituted from what had been shredded by the Stasi at the beginning of the change.
Excuse me, here I am. I was wondering, as far as surveillance, did you drive or were you mostly on foot as far as surveillance? Did you have a car?
Better than that, I had a motorbike for the first research. And on that motorbike, I rode straight into an unmarked military base, which is an important thing to know if you're wondering why they thought I might be a spy. Mostly, I had a car only once in the 1980s, but mostly I took taxis and buses, or walked.
Was surveillance covert, did you see anybody?
No, but they themselves comment, she does not control herself, by which they meant I'm not constantly looking around to see if someone is following me. So I decided that it was just going to be too difficult to do research if I were constantly expecting that someone was on my tail. So I tended to underplay the possibility.
Thanks very much for your comments. Great discussion. We know that we tend to learn things from what other people see in us. Was there anything in your file that was described? Sorry, was there anything in your file that they found that was particularly interesting to you, as far as something about yourself or a habit that you might have had, or something that was particularly interesting that they identified?
Well, this business about saying that I was a good spy made me stop and wonder about my research practices. But otherwise, no, I don't think I would say that they did. But they certainly had their own interpretations about a lot of stuff that I had done, or people that I'd seen. And so I had to try to take those interpretations seriously. Well, why might they have thought this?
Hello. I taught high school seniors for many years, and one of my favorite guest speakers was a lady who was a member of our council, very close friend of Hal Burnson, and her name is Katherine Coleman. She had been selected, I think in the early 90s, to go to Romania, and she went from place to place within the country to, in so many words, teach them how to set up an election. Not so much every facet of the primary process, but in so many words, how to have a democratic process. My question to you then, perhaps on her behalf, and not to judge her effectiveness, but is to say, where are we now? Do the Romanians have any prayer of free and fair elections?
Well, I won't show my hand by reversing the question, but in 1997, I was there in the village that I had worked in for a while, and they were having local elections. It was for the mayor and the councilors of the commune and so on. And so I went to one of the policemen and said, I'm really interested in observing this election, if I might be allowed to. And it turned out that I couldn't, but there was a note in my file. There was a note someplace. It wasn't in my file because my file was terminated in 90, and this was 97, that indicated I had been interested in something I shouldn't be. Now, free and fair elections in the Romanian context is, it's not surprisingly, the people who have control over most of the media and other opportunities to get their word spread are more likely to get the kind of publicity that they need to be elected. And so I'm not sure that I would say any of the elections they've had has represented fairly the full range of difference among Romanian citizens. But it also hasn't been bad. I mean, it's been sort of okay. And now I think things are potentially getting worse because, like Hungary and Poland, where new autocratic leaders are setting up illiberal democracy, as the governor or the prime minister of Hungary declared. In Romania, too, there is a strong man who is gradually pushing his way to power, even though he has been sentenced for graft and a variety of other things with a suspended sentence. But he is working very hard now to get his stooges in all of the most important positions, and that will definitely affect the potential for the elections that come next.
We'll take one more question here.
Yes, I was wondering whether any of your academic colleagues in Romania were attempting to carry out field research in Western democracies, even the United States, and had encountered surveillance or felt that they had.
Interesting question. I don't know about, I wouldn't know about a lot of this because I'm not on the Fulbright Commission that reads for grants coming to the US. But one of my own former students has a grant this spring semester to do a project in New York on the water infrastructure. Now, I haven't asked him if he feels he's been followed. I will now.
That's great.
Okay?
Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. Can't wait to read the book. We have a little bit for Jefferson Cup, which is our tradition. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, Margaret. Much appreciate you sharing your story.
Yes, I wanted to thank Margaret for all the work she did to put this together. It's been a wonderful occasion for me and a great opportunity to see what a great organizer she is.
And thank you to the staff, Shirley, and together too. And please, she'll stay after the program, and if you'd like to get a book there, she'll do a book signing. And thank you all for coming out.